This is why presidential debates are becoming unwatchable.
You want me to answer?
How much did you cut the bar?
You don't know what's happening.
Gentlemen.
This is not a cage match.
The American Lyceum rebuilds the institution of debate as a cornerstone of our democracy. Once vital and informative, presidential debates have devolved into disrespectful, open mic,
Because you'd be in jail.
cage matches, abetted by cable media and partisan extremism.
The questions that have been asked so far in this debate illustrate why the American people don't trust the media.
When the only rules are ratings, politicians of all stripes aim to destroy instead of debate.
This reminds everybody of what they cannot stand about Washington.
That's an election. This is what we're here for. It's an election.
Setting a cultural tone that unleashes hostility on the streets. Mob violence by the left wing and the right wing are tolerated and normalized. Today, 30% of Democrats and 30% of Republicans believe political violence is justified. Tone at the top matters. For the republic to survive, we the people must learn to talk to one another again.
That was a hot mess. It wasn't even a debate. The American people lost tonight.
The Lyceum format is focused on finding solutions, not a binary resolution. 3 participants have 3 minutes to propose 3 ideas aimed at one problem. The American Lyceum. Let us rebuild the foundation of civil society. Today's Lyceum debate answers the question, what are the best ways to boost entrepreneurship? We have 3 participants who will each present a 3.5-minute opening statement, followed by 2 minutes of question and answer, and 2 minutes of closing statement. The first participant is Joni Cobb, Emmy Award-winning writer and director, and currently the board chair of the Center for American Entrepreneurship. The second participant is Carl Schramm, university professor at Syracuse University, spent a decade as president of the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, and author of numerous books, including Burn the Business Plan in 2018. The third participant is Bob Litan, co-founder of the American Lyceum, and author of numerous books, including Resolved, Debate Can Revolutionize Education and Help Save Our Democracy. Let's talk, listen, and learn together. The first participant is Joni Cobb.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here today, especially to represent what's known as flyover country in our perspective. While there's going to be myriad ideas out there today, especially to grow the entrepreneurial economy, the 3 ideas I propose represent some of the most urgent views from the many entrepreneurs I've personally worked with outside of the well-known coast. First, and frankly second, I'd like to address access to capital. Access to capital always comes up with working with entrepreneurs, but for good reason. It is the lifeblood of running their companies. Experience has shown that communities assume that beyond maybe mentoring, some seed funding, that entrepreneurs are basically on their own, or some VC will step in and give them all they need to succeed, the adage that all good deals get funded. This is an adage that might make sense if you're in Boston and San Francisco and, frankly, a white male. But this has not been my experience in working with a diverse set of entrepreneurs in the middle of the country. My first suggestion to address this is to mobilize more angel investors through a federal tax credit. Besides just funding the operations and growth, studies have shown that startups funded by angel investors are more likely to survive, build employment, and exit. According to the SEC, there are another 12 million American households that would meet the accredited investor criteria to become angels. But most are likely unaware of what angel investing is and the opportunity to participate in funding startups. If only 3% of the 12 million additional potential angels chose to allocate a portion of their financial portfolios to angel investing, the number of active angel investors would double to 650,000, and presumably the amount of capital invested would double to $50 billion annually. Second, my second capital suggestion is designed to address the inequities in equity funding for women and entrepreneurs of color. We need to increase the diversity in the pool of investors participating in investment funds, not just the recipients. In recent years, women entrepreneurs have reportedly received only about 2% of total equity capital, while entrepreneurs of color have received about 1%. This unbalanced distribution of equity capital is attributed to both explicit bias on the part of some investors, but also unintentional bias. Recent research has documented a phenomenon known as homophily. Investors tend to invest in entrepreneurs who look like them, have similar backgrounds, and who are launching companies they can relate to. Greater diversity among those who invest in startups would result in more capital being directed to women founders and entrepreneurs of color. The Investment Company Act of 1940 establishes the legal framework for the establishment, operation, and regulation of investment funds. Many private investment funds are organized under the 3C1 of the Act. Sorry to get wonky, but it requires funds participants to be accredited investors, but limits the number of investors to 100. I propose we expand the parameters of 3C1, expanding the amount each fund can raise, as well as the amount of investors allowed in these funds. It would provide emerging fund managers significant additional capital to invest in a more diverse range of entrepreneurs, and raising the number of permitted investors keeps the contribution of individual fund participants comparatively small, meaning that more accredited women investors and investors of colors could participate. And lastly, we need to enact portable and affordable childcare. We are leaving talent on the sidelines that would otherwise start and build innovative companies, and we need to ask ourselves why. Roundtables that the Center for Entrepreneurship conduct regularly with entrepreneurs have revealed that the high cost of reliable childcare is a major obstacle to thriving entrepreneurship, particularly among women. A lack of access to affordable childcare prevents many would-be entrepreneurs from pursuing their new business ideas and can significantly complicate the entrepreneurial experience, increasing the chances of failure. Expanded access to affordable and reliable childcare, therefore, is a profoundly pro-entrepreneurship, pro-innovation, pro-growth policy imperative. Thank you.
So, Joni, that was a great list. Could you clarify how you would know if you expand the criteria for permissible investors that these additional people would actually be more women and more people of color?
Well, because at the Center for American Entrepreneurship, we work directly in our dialogue with emerging funds, particularly Black and Latino and female-run funds that have told us specifically that this is the one most powerful thing that we could do to attract more investors of color and women.
Joni, those are great suggestions. I want to ask the question about discrimination in investment. And I should say at the outset, at least 25% of my angel investing has been in women-owned firms. So the question is, do these firms not gather investment because of their ideas, or is it discrimination on the basis of color and race? Color and gender, excuse me.
So, certainly many people have made the case that there's overt discrimination. I think where I'm really more interested in addressing is that whole idea of a homophily. When you have the majority of equity investors that are investing in things that feel familiar, feel safer, feel more likely to succeed, it only makes sense that that is maybe their first choice to invest in. So I don't think necessarily it's discrimination in an overt sense, but it is investing in who you know, what feels comfortable, what feels safe that you can relate to. So that's the whole point of increasing investors with a diverse viewpoint to increase the types of companies that they invest in.
So, Joni, that was an interesting set of ideas. On your second one, having to do with this C1 category, how would you know if you expanded this that you would actually get more women and people of color investing as opposed to just the general population? So how do you know it would actually be targeted?
Well, there's a couple of points about this. First of all, we have heard regularly at the Center for American Entrepreneurship, that's a mouthful, from these actual Black and brown emerging fund managers that they believe that it is the absolute most important thing we could do to increase the number of those entrepreneurs, both on the investor side as well as the investing in them side. But what I would also say to that is there's really nothing to lose here. You're talking about putting more capital to deploy for entrepreneurs. You're bringing in more money off the sidelines. And so whether or not you believe it works or not in the next 5 years, we can certainly study it. But there's no downside to deploying more angel capital that are sitting, frankly, on the sidelines right now.
Okay. Joni, that was a very interesting list of three great ideas. And in fact, I agree wholeheartedly with one of them in terms of making much more capital available. But here goes the question. And I was wondering if you thought maybe some of these entrepreneurs who come up who are black and brown and females may not have technical businesses that would attract more capital faster.
So I can tell you anecdotally, and I know there's studies that purport that actually, especially in the area of women entrepreneurs, they've had far more success in building and scaling some of these companies. But my own experience here in the middle of the country is some of our more technical founders have been women. We have more and more women going into the STEM fields. In fact, they're outpacing men in many universities, and they're coming out with these fantastic ideas, and they start running companies, and they get, frankly, a lot of questions from investors that have to do with their personal life and how it might affect their building and scaling their companies. So I take great issue that it's not because we don't have a supply of these entrepreneurs that are building scalable companies that are female or entrepreneurs of color. And we've made great inroads in launching more and more of these companies. But I would say that there's no way that 1% makes sense to me that that's where all the equity capital is going, is to women, that we don't have more than 1% of qualified, amazing female founders and more than 2% of qualified entrepreneurs of color running scalable companies that we should be investing in.
Let's start with the premise that we'll never have enough entrepreneurs. Now, what do we do to increase the number? In the United States, which should be our focus, I think there are three things. First, we should change the prevailing narrative. Right now, if you talk to people who are unfamiliar with entrepreneurship, they will tell you, for the most part, oh, that's a game for young people, people who are 19, 20, 21. We still carry this notion of the age of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates in our head, that that's when entrepreneurship happens. In reality, the average age of a person starting a business in the United States is about 38. And it's really important that people understand that so they have confidence. Maybe when they have their great idea, which is more likely to happen in middle age or later middle age, that's actually normal and they should pursue it. The second thing I would talk about would be very much like Joni's point. We need more money available to entrepreneurs. And my solution is basically we should change the Dodd-Frank legislation so that local banks can take the risk on young entrepreneurs and small businesses, not necessarily young entrepreneurs, but young companies. We should remember historically that when people were starting a business, before we even called them entrepreneurs, and it's estimated, by the way, just for a historic reference, that coming back from World War II, about 40% of all our GIs attempted to start a business. Now, where did they get their money? There was no venture capital industry at all. What they went to was their local bank, people who knew them and people who could take risk with the balance sheet of the local bank, infuse the first amount of money. If the entrepreneur was doing well and the business was doing well, they could give them a second round, third round. We didn't even call it rounds. They were additional loans to get the businesses started. That's virtually impossible to do anymore. You can't go to a neighborhood bank. First of all, they don't exist much, but you can't go to a bank and actually get funding for a startup. And that is a huge problem for us. We've all switched our narrative into the world of venture capital. And venture capital, even now, accounts for a very small amount of the money put behind new firms. Joni's pointed this out in terms of how new startups actually get money. And most of it's from friends and family and angel investors. And if we had more of them, there'd be more local money, but we'd have a huge increase if banks could go in the business of taking risks on small companies. The third point I want to make is that many times in publicly funded entrepreneurship programs at the community level, and virtually every community, city, county has new incubators and whatnot, one of the dangerous narratives that's delivered in these instances is that the job of the entrepreneur is restart the economy in the locality. So you can start a business, but your other job is to refresh the economy of Rochester or Toledo or Kansas City. It's hard enough to start a business, and we shouldn't overburden an entrepreneur with a view that they actually have a civic responsibility of restarting an economy.
Well, Carl, I love that, particularly talking about the banks. As the daughter of a senior loan officer in a local bank, I can tell you I had that debate with my father many times. My question is, do you think that that is really an uphill battle to get banks to think about the risk portfolio of startups in a traditionally uber conservative culture?
I think it is an uphill battle, largely because folks like your father have basically retired. There isn't a culture inside the banking community that sees its responsibility to help start local businesses. And this is a really critical issue. And when I say it's uphill, it's going to require changing federal law, and then it's going to require a conversation inside the banking community about what this potential could be. And we see it all the time. Banks are trying to start these specific funds or specific outreaches to minorities, to women to start their businesses, but it's always seen as a separate matter, and it should be part of the daily work of every bank.
So, Carl, all three of your points are fascinating. On the first one about changing the narrative, isn't it the case that the pandemic largely changed the narrative? We saw probably millions of people sort of picking up and changing their lives, starting businesses like crazy. Does that make you more optimistic that your narrative's going to come true?
I don't think so, Bob. I've looked at that data pretty carefully, and basically, people without jobs, they really weren't fired in most cases. They were just sidelines. Don't show up, and they didn't really have anything to do. We had a huge labor force sitting at home, not knowing what to do, and we hadn't been through this in a long time. It's been a long time since we've had even a major recession that put people on the sidelines. And in this case, it looks as if people sat out and now they're coming back and they didn't start a business in the meantime.
So we're here today to talk about boosting entrepreneurship. And the major reason why, from an economic point of view, is that entrepreneurs are key to boosting our long-run rate of economic growth, which has stagnated probably now for 4 or 5 decades. We just haven't been able to boost it. And at the same time, our rate of really dynamic entrepreneurship has gone down. And so we have to get more growth, but that shouldn't be our only objective. We need to make sure that that growth is broadly shared. If there's one thing we've learned from the fact that our country is basically falling apart or being ripped apart at the seams, is that a lot of people feel like that they've been left behind. And we can't, I think, sustain any kind of public policy to promote entrepreneurship unless the growth is broadly shared. And third, if we get more growth, we're going to have more disruption. And more disruption means more job loss. And there will be even more or greater problems in transition. So we need policies to ease the transition from one job to another. So here are my 3 ideas. On number 1, on getting more entrepreneurs, the obvious thing to do is to greatly expand the entrepreneurship visa or the startup visa. We need more immigrants to come in who already have established businesses. There are easy ways to set the benchmarks in terms of the amount of capital they've raised or how many employees and get them to start businesses here. The one thing that Carl and I saw at the Kauffman Foundation is that immigrants start businesses at roughly twice the rate of Native Americans. We need more immigrants. Although, here's the politics. We're not going to get that change unless we also solve a huge problem at the border, because there's a lot of skepticism right now about how there's a massive refugee crisis, and we're going to need some political compromises to solve that problem in order to get to the point where we get more immigrant entrepreneurs. Second idea, in order to deal with broadly shared growth, we need, in my view, much more financing of what I call lifetime training accounts, where people can change careers, take courses and so forth, and if they need the money, borrow the money and repay it to the federal government on an income contingent basis. Namely, if their incomes increase, they pay a certain percentage of their increased incomes to the government, but if they don't have to pay. So that at least they don't get burdened with the kind of debt that we see with college students. And for those people who are unable, for any number of reasons, to get more training, I think we ought to greatly expand the earned income tax credit so that we lift the incomes of the lower income portion of our population so that we have broader shared growth through that income transfer mechanism. And finally, when it comes to job displacement, I've been a long advocate of a system of what I call wage insurance. Namely, if you lose your job, the government would make up some portion of the difference between your old job and your new one. So for example, if you lost $10,000 a year in having to take a new job, the government would pick up maybe 50% of the difference for a couple of years, so that the pain of moving from one job to another is not as great as it has been for the last several decades. And in my view, that disruption is one of the major reasons, in addition to rising income inequality, that we've had such severe political disruption as well in this country.
Bob, I love this idea of a lifetime training account. But that is going to offend a lot of Americans who basically have thought this notion of reinventing yourself was your own responsibility. So when people put out of a job, part of our American culture was, okay, this is a chance to reinvent yourself. Now, a lot of people have done that. And do we have a parallel situation coming up where people think, well, this is just going to be college loans all over again, and the people who really need them don't get them?
Well, I think what I really want to focus on are the rifle shots, the kind of 2 or 3 additional courses you need in order to make a transition. And there are a lot of places you can get that training, whether it's online or in person. I'm not looking to finance people. They can, if they want, to go back to school forever. But I think much shorter, quick hitting kind of things that can basically switch the trajectory of their careers. That limits the amount of loans and also the obligations to pay back.
So, Bob, I couldn't agree more with it's a lot of agreeing here, but I guess it's an issue of priority. So for me, when employment is at record lows, what do you think your argument would be for prioritizing all of this effort for displaced workers?
Well, I think I've already prioritized because these are my big 3. I think displaced work, the displaced worker problem is something that's true regardless of the level of unemployment. Because even today we have a huge mismatch in the kinds of job openings and the people who are sitting on the sidelines who are basically not qualified to fill these job openings. And so I view the lifetime training account merging with a wage insurance in a way to basically enable people to qualify for the kinds of assistance for the jobs that have a lot of job openings. And at the same time, wage insurance cushions the pain while they're making that transition.
Well, first of all, I loved hearing all the ideas today, and that's not just me pandering to the crowd. It's that we need to do as many of these thought out policies and ideas as possible to increase entrepreneurship, because we are, as a country, at a 40-year low in our rates of entrepreneurial building, and that is a crisis. And this is occurring in all 50 states. So everything that we can do is matters. But I think what we need to do quickly is do what we can do to increase the bench of entrepreneurs to start new companies, the actual number of entrepreneurs out there starting companies. So one thing we did not talk about really in the Q&A that I think is critical is addressing the child care issue. CAE, we've done roundtables around the country, and it has come up as the number 1 reason keeping women entrepreneurs on the sideline, especially after the pandemic. So I absolutely think that needs to remain as top of the conversation. And secondarily, those ideas that I had around capital are very easy to put into place right away, especially the 3C1. It doesn't cost anyone any money. Everyone is clamoring for these exceptions, and that would increase diversity and capital day one.
Today's debate points out something that's very interesting, and it should keep us humble about what it is we propose. Joni has just told us the statistic that counts above everything. 40 years, we're at a low of the number of people starting businesses. Now, in that 40 years, America got very, very excited about entrepreneurship. We established programs in almost every college and university to encourage undergraduates to take up the role of entrepreneurship. More importantly, I think, we established in town after town, city after city, county after county, public programs to encourage entrepreneurs. If after all that energy, we are at a low in terms of people starting their businesses, we have to ask big questions. And that's why I argue that we have to change this narrative. The notion that this is a kid's game and the only people who are going to be able to successfully operate at this is that they're 20 years or 19 or 21. It's just a false thing, and it represents an inability to see the reality that we have to deal with. We have to change the whole drumbeat, the whole concept. People who are entrepreneurs are not like, for the most part, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Okay, they're not Mark Zuckerbergs. The people who do this and keep the economy refreshed are people on our streets starting businesses, smaller businesses, plumbers, electricians, storekeepers, and many of them grow to be sizable businesses and create jobs for other people. The question of how we get more money to people when they do this has been talked to by everybody here, and it's a critical ingredient. And the last thing I would say is we just have to be very careful about what it is we think we're arguing for, so we don't get into special pleadings thinking that the answer to getting more entrepreneurs is this or that or the other thing.
So we have a lot of agreement here today. We all know how important entrepreneurs are to the future of our country. And I certainly agree with Carl that there is no silver bullet here. In fact, viewers watching today have found that there are at least 9 silver bullets. And I hesitate to prioritize any of them because I think we need to do them all. And Carl makes another interesting point that we spent 40 years, 30, 40, how many, talking about this problem, and yet the rate of entrepreneurship has gone down except for the blip during the pandemic, and economic growth has barely budged. So we ought to be humble about what we're recommending. But you know, throughout this entire period, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think either party, or I can think, it's hard to think of any major presidential candidate who has made essentially entrepreneurship as the #1 theme of their campaign. And I'm including not just presidents, I'm talking about people level of Congress, all levels of government. When Carl talks about changing the narrative and Joni talks about expanding capital, these are not themes that are top of mind. You don't see them on cable TV shows, heaven forbid. You don't see them on local TV. You see occasional, articles that praise the super entrepreneurs and so forth. But America is, I don't have to tell viewers here, we're facing a huge crisis here politically and also a collective loss of national confidence. We need a boost of confidence. We need the kind of change in narrative that we're talking about today, and we need it from our political leaders. We don't need people, poor-mouthing businesses. We need to be celebrate business formation, and we ought to also have policies, as I've talked about, that can make sure that when the successful entrepreneurs come forward, that everybody else basically goes along for the ride.
Thanks for watching. There are 3 ways you can help us strengthen civil society. 1, like this video. 2, share the link. And 3, subscribe to the Lyceum Debates YouTube channel. Now that you've heard the debate, it's time to cast your vote for what you think were the best ideas. Here's how it works. Go to the AmericanLyceum.org debates page to cast your vote. Or you can go directly to the voting page by clicking the link in the description below. This debate was made possible thanks to the J.P. Conte Family Foundation. If you support our effort to rebuild American civil society, please make a donation to the Lyceum right now. Your donation will be tax deductible and is deeply needed. Go to theamericanlyceum.org. Thanks again to all the Lyceum donors who are rebuilding American civil society.